Well, good evening. I'm here at home with a bit of a cold, so I'm going to tell you a little bit about the movie I'm going to show in just a second, which is 2 episodes of McHale's Navy. Now, this starred Ernest Borgnine. Ernest Borgnine was an Academy Award-winning actor. He played good guys and bad guys and done very respectable acting. But when these were made, which I believe is in the early 1960s, he ended up as playing Quentin McHale, which in this comedy on television. Now, this is a World War II comedy, and you have to remember in the 1960s there were still millions of men who'd been in World War II. In any kind of episodic show like this one that made fun of the commanding officers was very popular. And there had been a previous one called You'll Never Get Rich, or Sergeant Bilko, starring Phil Silvers. In that case, they're always running rings around a commanding officer who can never figure out what's going on. In this case, they transferred it to the Navy. Tim Conway is one of the principal players, and you'll see the very first episode in which he's introduced. Another man that's regular on this cast is Ensign Gruber, who's played by the magician Carl Ballantine. You may remember from the Comedy Magician DVD that we showed. And a man named Joe Flynn, who died unfortunately at a very early age, plays the Commander Binghamton. So with all these guys in place, there was one other person, and I'll admit that I've cut him out, and his name was Fuji. He shows up for just a second, and that's a Japanese man that played a prisoner of war that they had sort of captured, or he gave himself up, and anyway, he's one of them, so they're always having to hide him from the commanding officer. But even though I think at the time this was made that Fuji was put in to kind of soften any sort of anti-Japanese sentiment that this kind of show might develop, it's still not something that's in keeping with our sensibilities of today. So I've cut him out, but it is interesting to note that he became a high-placed executive with the Toyota company once this show was over. So he does a good job on the show, and you'll see him maybe for just a few seconds. I've left him in here and there. Anyway, without further ado, here's McHale's Navy. Well, good evening and welcome to a showing of, good afternoon and welcome to a showing of McHale's Navy. This is a show from the 1960s. It's a World War II comedy. There were some movies that it was probably based on, like Operation Petticoat, and some other comic movies that Tony Curtis and Cary Grant made. It's also based on Phil Silvers' comedy about the Army from the 1950s called sometimes the Phil Silvers Show, other times You'll Never Get Rich, which is from an army song that they took that out of. So Phil Silvers was a very funny guy and a burlesque comedian of very accomplished skills. Now, most of the people in this show are comic actors. In fact, it stars Ernest Borgnine, who was a very serious actor, won Academy Awards, played good guys, bad guys, but very seldom played comic parts, but he does in this program. And you'll see tonight's episode is the introduction of Tim Conway, who's a lieutenant that is put in there for a lot of slapstick comedy. And there's also Ensign Gruber, who's played by Carl Ballantine, who was a vaudeville magician, performed for years and years, and in fact I think he was included on the Magician DVD that we showed earlier. So all these folks are put together to make fun of their commanding officer, who's played by Joe Flynn. And this was very popular with people of the time because in the 1960s the United States was filled with literally millions of men who'd served in World War II and liked to see their commanding officers made fun of. There was also a role of a Japanese prisoner of war, another comic role, which I've tried to cut out of here as best I can because it's probably not good for today's sensibilities, but I think at the time it was put in the 60s, it was to present a little more friendly picture of the Japanese. And but the show is not really about the war. It's really, that's just a backdrop for the shenanigans of McHale's and his crew, who are always scheming and trying all kinds of money-making scams on people. So, oh, incidentally, Fuji later became an executive high up in the Toyota organization, so he did very well for himself once he left this show. And without further ado, here's McHale's Navy. Hi. Today we're going to show 2 episodes of McHale's Navy. One of which is, I believe, the very first episode, which introduces Tim Conway as a lieutenant, and he meets McHale and his gang. McHale is played by Ernest Borgnine, a Academy Award-winning actor who played many serious roles, played many heavies, but he's a comic kind of ringmaster in this thing, and his crew is always up to something. They're always trying to make money off of some deal, and they're hardly ever focused on the war. The commanding officer in this show is played by a guy named Joe Flynn, who unfortunately died at a very early age, but he's a very, very funny comedian. And he's the guy that's always sputtering and trying to figure out what McHale and his gang of pirates, as he calls them, are up to. Also on the show is Carl Ballantine, the famous vaudeville magician, who was in one of the comedy DVDs of magicians that we showed. So all these folks went together, and the background of this is in the South Pacific. So it's the war with Japan during World War II. But this is softened not only on the show, but also I've tried to take out anything that I think would be offensive to today's sensibilities. There was a gentleman who played a part named Fuji, who was a prisoner of war, who was sort of one of McHale's group, and he just shows up in here briefly, but he later became an executive with Toyota, so I guess he did pretty well out of the show as well. So there's a lot of comedy in these things, but it's in the background of a story, and it's in the background of letting World War II veterans, of whom there were millions at this time, see commanding officers being made fun of. So here we go, McHale's Navy.